Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Keith, and I'm the director of the Jacobin Humanities Institute and a professor in the Department of Classics and Women and Gender Studies Institute here at the University of Toronto. Recognizing that we're gathering here today on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Métis people, it is with humility and gratitude that we convene today to explore the crafting of history and art in this JHI-sponsored session on India's first female leader, with Ruby Lal and Molly Crabapple in conversation with Randy Boyagoda. I want to acknowledge that the City of Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. While the Toronto Purchase was signed for this parcel of land, we recognize that the Mississaugas were not properly compensated and that more land was taken than originally agreed upon. We value the contributions that Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island have made, both in shaping and in strengthening our community, our province, and our country. The long history of conquest and colonization is one that the humanities legacy knows and bears responsibility for as well. Let this acknowledgement serve as a reminder of our ongoing efforts to recognize, honor, reconcile, and partner with the Indigenous peoples and groups whose lands and waters we benefit from today. We are all treaty people. While we have arrived at this place differently, all of us share a responsibility to honor the treaties. So this year we've been very fortunate this semester to have Ruby Lal in our midst as our visiting public humanities fellow. She's an acclaimed historian of India whose conceptual work on labor has catalyzed many of our conversations this term. And we're thrilled to have been able to organize this event to showcase the work that she's been doing up at the JHI this term. Ruby's recently published biography, Empress, The Astonishing Reign of Nur Jahan, won the 2018 Georgia Author of the Year Award in Biography and was also a finalist in history for the LA Times Book Prize. Among the top 10 picks of Time Magazine, the Telegraph and Prospect Magazine London, Empress has been lauded by the New Yorker, the Guardian, the New York Times, the BBC, the Indian Express, Business Standard, and numerous other national and international journals, magazines, and newspapers. She's professor of South Asian history at Emory University and divides her time between Atlanta and Delhi. Ruby will be in conversation this afternoon with Molly Crabapple, an artist and writer based in New York. They're collaborating on Tiger Slayer, a young reader edition of Ruby's biography of Mughal Empress Nur Jahan, widely regarded as India's Cleopatra. Molly herself is the author of 2 books, Drawing Blood and Brothers of the Gun with Marwan Hisham, which was longlisted for a National Book Award in 2018. Her reportage won the 2022 Bernhardt Labor Journalism Award, and so she fits right in with our theme this year, and has been published in the New York Times, New York Review of Books, the Paris Review, Vanity Fair, The Guardian, Rolling Stone, The New Yorker, and elsewhere. Her art is in the permanent collection of the New York Museum of Modern Art, and her animations have been nominated for 3 Emmys and won an Edward R. Murrow Award. Molly and Ruby will be in conversation with the U of T's very own writer, critic, and scholar, Randy Boyagoda, the author of 4 novels, a Shirk-supported critical biography, and a scholarly monograph. His fiction has been nominated for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and Impact Dublin Literary Prize, and named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice Selection and Globe and Mail Best Book of the Year. He contributes essays, reviews, and opinions to publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, The Walrus, First Things, Commonweal, Harper's Financial Times UK, Guardian, New Statesman, and Globe and Mail, in addition to appearing frequently, as I for one can attest, on CBC Radio and podcasting for the Toronto Public Library. He served as the president of PEN Canada 2015 to 2017, and is currently a member of the Walrus Educational Review Committee and the boards of the Toronto International Festival of Authors and the Conference on Christianity and Literature.
Thank you very much, Allison, and welcome everyone on this bracket US Thanksgiving Day. I want to welcome to the university and to the city, Molly, and of course we've had Ruby with us over the last few months as a public humanities fellow coming to us by way of Emory. So I think what we're going to do for the next little while is have a conversation about this work, Empress, just as much about collaboration, about what collaboration means. I think very much so at the same time about the public humanities and what the public humanities mean in terms of the very decision, I think, to collaborate on a new version of Empress. And so I just want to begin maybe with, and we're going to hear directly from both Ruby and Molly. Ruby by way of pages, and Molly by way of some of the striking images that she's already assembling for this project. But I think I want to begin just with a couple of very basic questions, kind of set the ground for the conversation, if that makes sense. Ruby, why this book now?
So this is first of all, a moment of gratitude. I have to extend these gratitudes because it's been an amazing semester at JHI. Allison's visionary leadership, the fabulous team with Kim, Cheryl, Sonia, Monica, my co-fellows, visitors, guests, my partner especially flew in, and this amazing team. With that, why this now? Actually, this now has been going on for quite some time. It's a very extended now. So this young adult version of Empress that's brewing has actually been happening. It began happening while I was on the road with Empress. Each time I gave a talk, somebody or the other in the audience would stand up and say, "Oh, why don't you write this for young adults? I have a daughter or I have a son who would like to read this." And so this happened about 15 or 16 times. And there was a simultaneous story that was happening in all of those, virtually all of those settings, which is that I was meeting Molly Crabapple in literary festivals, in different kinds of, we met in Beirut, in Jaipur, in Boulder, in New York.
In Vancouver or no, not Vancouver.
Not Vancouver. So this was parallelly happening. And then I went to Sweden. And literally for the 18th or 19th time, somebody said to me, "Why don't you do this for young adults?" By which time Molly and I were writing letters to each other. That is, I was writing the old-fashioned way, and Molly was sending me beautiful drawings. Do you want to show them the eye you sent me? Because
Yes.
That eye has a lot of meaning in our relationship.
Let me do the share screen first. I apologize for any technical snafus. It's my.
So anyway,
just while we're waiting, what is this thing you call a letter? Just for
yes,
fascinating.
So you're asking for some very interesting private detail. I think one is, of course, going to the old form because we, just literally writing by hand.
Yeah.
Right. But also, what was I going to write? "Hi, Molly, how are you? How's this going?" No. I think it became a document of the pandemic.
Exactly.
It became a document of our budding friendship. It became a document of the tree. It became a document of my father dying. Time. Right? I was asked, why not young adults? It just hit me that I think, and I think I can do this.
Great.
So I rang Molly, and within minutes we were agreed that to do this.
So then let me flip it then. So Molly, for you, and this is coming out of your 2018 book, the collaboration set in Syria, Brothers of the Gun.
Yes.
So following up that, which of course, as I think Alice was mentioning, certainly had quite a strong public response. Why this book now for you?
A few reasons. The first is, and I just also want to extend my extreme gratitude to be here. I feel so lucky to be in Canada and with my great friend and brilliant collaborator here. I think the first thing was that I had spent years documenting horrible things about war, about prisons, about Guantanamo Bay. And when I read Empress, because Ruby sent me a copy, long before we decided to do this collaboration, I was like, this is so beautiful. This is like life. I wanted to do work that wasn't just about the ugly and horrifying aspects of the world, but that were also about the golden and beautiful ones. I've always loved Mughal miniatures. I was a little girl, in New York City, and I would go to the Islamic section of the Museum of Modern Art, and I would sit with my face like pressed up to the glass. Probably they wanted to kick me out, just looking at the extreme delicacy and perfection, of how the faces were drawn and how the borders were drawn. And when Ruby proposed this idea to me, I was like, this is wonderful. I felt almost like I could kind of heal the more messed up, damaged parts of myself. And also I could plunge into an artistic tradition that I had loved for so long, but I'd never really gotten the opportunity to throw myself into.
Was there a contact point when you were reading Empress and Ruby described some of those miniatures in the book itself and some of the representations? I mean, did that bring you back to those moments at the Met?
My God, especially there's actually I'm going to do a screen share again. There was a miniature that I know Ruby is going to talk about, which is a portrait of Nur Jahan loading a musket. And there's so much about this. I mean, Ruby can talk about why it's unusual in sort of the Mughal canon, but for me, there was also like just the visceral things about like the green kind of modeled, beautiful texturedness of it, about the extreme details of the patterns, about these faces of this with this profound sort of sense of like strength and patience and defiance that are in profile. That did bring me back to that.
Great. Okay, so speaking of bringing back, and the fact that what we're looking at here is a collaboration with a kind of a public focus with respect to it being a book for young adults, perhaps to kind of elaborate a little bit on the conversation, especially for those who might not yet know as much about Nur Jahan. Ruby, take us back to when you were 9 years old, living 150 miles north of Delhi. And it was an afternoon with your mother, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Tell us about that moment and how that moment brought us to where we are today.
Yeah, I think that's the loveliest question anyone can ask me, because so I've been an academic. I've written 2 books in academic form, and then I decided to write Empress. But for a couple of reasons, I was not persuaded that I wanted the calcified academic discourse, right? And the reasons are very simple. One is that Noor is a household name in South Asia, right? People know her and they kind of embrace her with gusto. But they also know her power. It's not that they don't know her power, but the power is almost in the minds of the people in the public imagination. It was what I call bullet point history, right? She's powerful, she did this, she led these amazing campaigns and so on. So I wanted the abundance into that notion of power. I wanted the granular detail of that power. And I knew that the academic stances would not help me in that. I didn't want to lose what I learned as an academic, because centrally embedded in this story is the question of evidence. How do you tell this? What are the grounds of this kind of history? So that was one. So there was this kind of notion of power and this kind of notion
when
of.
You were 9, though, what happened?
So I'm just giving you a background of why that was
So I was going to say, if you were thinking this way when you were 9,
no, this is why I went back to
I
that
see.
moment, because I'd actually forgotten that moment in a way, right? So the other thing was that love subsumed Nur Jahan. There's this kind of fabulous love story of her with the emperor, and she was all encapsulated. So these 2 things were happening, and I felt I did not know the real Nur. And I thought, what do I do to bring this woman back to history in all her splendor? And what form would I take? And that's when I went back to a moment I'd really lost, which was the moment of this afternoon with my mother when I was a little girl, when I had first heard about Nur Jahan. And I mentioned this because that's when I realized that, and this is something a lot of people, moving from academic writing to other forms of writing talk about, which is that I want to do storytelling. And I had to really think, what is storytelling?
Hmm.
What would my storytelling be? It's my mother's storytelling that helped me. And what was her storytelling precisely? One is that she told me in Hindi, right? Two, she called Nur Maharani, the queen of queens, right? And three, in storytelling, as so many fabulous thinkers and philosophers and storytellers will tell us, that story means the experience, the body, the eye contact, that your gut is getting involved, all these. And exactly this was happening between my mother and I. I mean, that's the collaboration that was going on. So this is something I'm very passionate about. If you ask me this, I will speak nonstop about storytelling.
Got it. Well, and I'm sure we will come back to it. I'm wondering now if we can just think a little bit about some of the, for lack of a better term, by way of your book, some of the more legendary features
Yeah,
of Noor's life versus, as you say, the kind of
yeah,
the work of a historian, the work, to kind of think through where she appeared, how she appeared, where she was erased, et cetera, et cetera. What are the temptations when it comes to the imagery associated with a
yes.
young adult version of this? I'm thinking about, for me, in this conversation, I want to talk about doves,
Mhm,
tigers,
mhm.
and coins. Those
Yes.
three visually, in thinking about your work, Molly, and having read your book, Ruby, those three things are in my head. So that's going to be 3 pointers, I guess. So doves, tigers, coins. Why don't we start with doves? What are they
Yeah,
in the legendary sense of things?
yeah. So dove, anybody holding a dove, any figure holding a dove in the iconography means it's a monarch, right? And in 1966, Haji Muhammad Sharif of Pakistan began a new movement of reviving Mughal art. And the first set of images that he drew were actually all of Noor. And so it's not an accident that he drew Noor holding a dove. It's not an accident that he drew Noor shooting a tiger, because only monarchs in those days were allowed to shoot a tiger, right? And so our young adult version book, we decided to call it Tiger Slayer, because it is not just that this woman is shooting tigers. This is an allegory of how do we know she's a monarch, right? Instead of saying Empress, the Astonishing Reign of Nur Jahan, we are just going to say Tiger Slayer.
Yes.
So now maybe we can talk about that exquisite. So sorry, let's just stay here for a minute. This is a really extraordinary image drawn in Noor's time.
Let me screen share it.
I think we were.
There.
So this is drawn at the kind of epitome of her career. But the important thing about this is drawn by the painter laureate of the court, who breaks from all his genre to draw this portrait. Right? And this is a portrait in action, meaning that Noor is loading the musket. She's not just holding the musket, she's loading the musket. And the other, interesting thing about there's a lot to be said. So anyway, to make the long story short, this is the only an unusual image that we have of a woman in full portraiture. A very unusual image that was never drawn before or never replicated again. But we do not have the tiger here.
Right.
So when we started collaborating on the book, this is what Molly drew.
So first I'll show you my sketch. These are the sort of
From the elephant.
nonsense rough sketches that I do to figure out my thinking. And then that was the final.
That's our final.
My goodness.
And now Molly can say what all she did, but I can tell you just this much. And
I wonder though, I'm mindful that not necessarily everyone here will know the kind of basic parts of the story. I'm wondering, so I'm wondering if we could just maybe take us from 1608 to 1611, when she marries as the 20th wife, through to, we don't have to go all the way to 1645, but just some basic points about who Noor was, just in case And then why
Yes.
an image like this, why an event like that
Yeah.
was so dramatic?
Yeah, I'll try to do this in 5 sentences, right?
Mhm.
Basically, she was the daughter of Persian migrants who were on their way, aristocratic folks, but not royal, who were fleeing persecution. And baby Noor was born outside, they were traveling in a caravan. She was born outside Kandahar in what is modern day Afghanistan on the road. The father finds employment in the court of Akbar the Great. There's lots of detail there, but eventually Noor is first married to an officer, has a daughter by him. There's political machinations. The first husband gets killed. She's brought back to the emperor's court, which is by this time not Akbar the Great, but his son Jahangir, the 4th Mughal emperor, who already has 19 wives. Noor's father by this time is the prime minister. And 3 years later, Noor marries the emperor. Now, what is unusual is,
So
and
this
she
is
writes,
1611.
this is 1611.
Okay.
And by 1613, we are witnessing extraordinary signs of her sovereignty. So 3 technical signs. One is, of course, the coins that are issued in her name, along with the emperor, imperial orders that are issued. These are things people knew about. But also what begins to appear in the record, which is what I document in this book, and which is why we're calling the book Tiger Slayer, the
Yes.
young adult version, is that there's copious recording on her hunting. And the hunting is really related to who a monarch is, right? So essentially, the book documents the sovereignty of Nur Jahan for a very critical reason. When we think of the great Mughals of India, we think they're all men, but there was one co-sovereign amongst them. So she rules along with her husband as a co-sovereign for 17 years, right? And she's not from the royal family, right? She's the daughter of Gayas and Asmat. So this is the basic storyline. And then we have all these metaphors and allegories and these very important figures for which the brilliant Molly Crabapple is doing amazing work.
So I'm curious on that very point, Molly. So based on that sense and the dramatic significance of the Tiger event, especially the beginning, it's very quickly immortalized by court poets, kind of spontaneously.
Yes.
Molly, what do you want to convey with an image like that to a young reader?
I wanted to convey the power and also the tension of the moment, right? Because imagine, on one hand, you're elevated, you're on, an elephant, you're in a howdah, you have a gun, but on the other hand, tigers are very frightening animals and very large and powerful animals. And your gun in that era, it was like what they had to load it with a musket ball, right?
Yeah.
It could jam at any moment, and tigers can leap very far. And that tension between like, will it get her or will she kill it? And for this piece, I really studied costuming in and pattern work in Mughal art to try to get like, how would an elephant that a royal figure rode, like what would it be decorated like? What would be the would it have like bangles on its feet? How would the howdah look, right? How would the man who was driving the elephant look? How would the tiger look in the moment, right? And it's all about the relationship between Noor's gaze and the tiger's gaze, and between them.
And so in that sense, what I also just really respond to is what Ruby, you point out in your book that the mahouts were anxious because when an elephant can sense a tiger, it becomes anxious. And to have an anxious elephant is not a good thing for anyone.
And it's rearing back, you can see it.
Yeah.
Exactly, that's what you're conveying, I think, quite
Yeah.
wonderfully.
Yeah.
And so the idea of shooting a tiger on an elephant
Yes.
that's already upset and rearing back. I mean, you put all those things together and it's a remarkable moment. And is it all the more so because it's a gendered moment, right? So that you have this exercise of power in gendered terms, which makes it all the more dramatic. So I guess what I'm curious about then is, with this as a major event, when you're telling this story, how do you decide for a young reader what to include and what to exclude, right? Another way to put it, when I'm teaching, I always like to talk about how genre pressures the telling of the story, right? In terms of what you can and can't put in something once you accept the conventions and the parameters of the genre. It's freeing and constraining. what's the story that you want to tell with Molly's striking imagery, with your words, that's fundamentally different than the story you're telling in Empress?
I think that's a great question. And I think this relates to, so one of the reasons when that question kept coming up, why don't you do YA, right? I wasn't sure that I was ready for it or that I wanted to do it, simply because it's another form, right? And I think the idea of a form like storytelling, right, is enunciated in a practice. It's not a given. I've been reading a fair bit around young adult literature, some extraordinary minds on it. And so one thing that I think now that I'm kind of, let's say 30% into the book, of course, it's a smaller book, but I was just saying to our undergraduate fellows at lunch that, I don't imagine my young or younger readers as any less than my adult readers, right? So it's not softening, it's not watering down. It's the same story. There is a new tension of the pictorial and the textual. So for instance, we decided that Molly's amazing pictures are not going to be just insertions, but that they're going to be spread over on the text so that the text itself is visual and the visual is also conveying something of the story, right? And that's a form I'm still struggling with, right? So one more time, I think not to reduce the impact of or the problems of the power that we are dealing with here to young people. I mean, I've been talking to 5 schools very, very actively, and it's extraordinary to see young people relate to this story. I mean, of course, they've not they've read the older version, and but their questions are our questions, right? They're asking things like, so, well, why didn't we hear about Nur, which is a question about evidence?
Right.
What did you do? Why are you fascinated with us, with her and us?
Sure.
Yes, that's right, right? And there's a group of there's a set of, I don't know if the teacher is joining us. Her name is Carrie Rees from the UK. The school called in London called the Tiffin Girls School. When they read the Tiffin Girls School, when they read this book, 18 girls actually wrote poems based on the chapters of this book, and it's exquisite accomplishment.
And a nice collaboration,
right? It's a collaboration. So I think, I like this hesitation that I'm feeling, or more than the hesitation, I think is the uncertainty of the form.
Yes, for how to make the story work, given the nature of the form. So I'm curious then for you, Molly. Now you've collaborated with others.
Yes, many times.
Yes. So I'm curious how collaboration works from your vantage with respect to the author, the text, your own work and interests, what you might be drawing from elsewhere. How do those things all kind of mix together in the way that you're going to tell this story?
Well, I mean, every collaboration is different, right? Depending on the project. What I did with Marwan for my last book, Brothers of the Gun, was in some ways much more intensive because I also co-wrote it. And so me and Marwan were like writing each other's sentences and rewriting them and battling and killing each other's darlings, holding each other's darlings hostage, and that was also something where I was writing about events that were still ongoing. At the time that me and Marwan were writing that book, ISIS still occupied Raqqa. And also they were events that we had photos and video of. So I would like interview Marwan about perhaps Emory had it like an ISIS checkpoint or in a cafe, and then I would do sketches of it and he would tell me wrong, and we would look at open source video that was posted online and we try to corroborate everything. And the idea was to basically get almost like a photo, a download of his memory is what he called it, right, as close as we could to accuracy. With Ruby, it's very different because we're writing about things that are long past, and that there are not, open source footage of a bunch of people with cell phones shooting Nur Jahan while she shoots the tiger, right? And the visual representations we have are very formalized. They're these beautiful miniatures. So there's so much to fill in, right? And one of the things for me that's thrilling about this collaboration is the chance to just learn so much about the visual life of the time. For instance, I'm going to bring up another image that we did from the book. It's a map that shows the journey of Nur Jahan's. I'm so sorry for my my son. Oh no, it's not screen shared right now. Here, let me share it with there. All right. Cool. Awesome. Okay, press share. Okay. All right. So this is a map that shows the journey of Nur Jahan's parents when they leave the Safavid Empire and they leave Herat to go to Fatehpur Sikri, which is a major city in the Mughal Empire. And when I did this picture, I was basically on WhatsApp all night with Ruby being like, yo, Ruby, you mentioned the Kandahar Gate. What does the Kandahar Gate looks like? And she's like, I don't know. No one knows. And I'm like, does it look like this? Does it look like this? Or I'm like, yo, Ruby, Fatehpur Sikri, what building? And she's like, use this type of red brick to indicate it. Another thing, so basically, and then I would be like, and then she would say like, I want movement in this. I don't just want it to be, buildings, right? So she's like, put animals in it, put the caravan in it. Or I would like ask her like, you talk about the salt flats in Sistan, what do they look like? And it was almost like this dialogue, like a figuring out, like an excavation, right? Like you're learning. And by the same token, like to do something like this, I spent a lot of time researching Mughal borders because Mughal borders are, just exquisite. Like here, I'll show you some close-ups so you can see a little bit more. So it's this woven, it's this amazing mathematical accomplishment how they do borders where you have like the vines weaving in and out, and then you have like bees and dragonflies and butterflies, and it all fits. It's like algebra and song made into ink on paper. I don't know how else to describe it. And so I would spend a lot of time analyzing that. I studied Arabic for 7 years, but I don't know Urdu or Farsi, and I never learned how to do like Nastaliq calligraphy, which is the type of calligraphy, that typically, Farsi would be written with. But I spent so long figuring out how to do it for this, and figuring out how the names would be written, because I wanted the map not just to be legible to us, but also to be legible to Noor if she read it.
Lovely.
And so something like this would very much be a dialogue, but also I would say an interrogation, right? Like,
yeah. Actually, I'd just love to respond to what Molly just said, because, so academically, I was trained as an historian, but realized very, very quickly part of the challenge of the discipline. But I also realized that art history was going to be this amazing treasure for me. So I really taught myself the iconographies of Mughal art. But with Molly, because of the question she's asking me, right, which even within the paradigm of art history, you can't answer, but I still have to think, right? So for instance, we've had, I think for the first time, the first image that Molly drew that hasn't generated in my gut is an image of baby Noor and her face, right? You want to show that?
Oh no, I don't have it. I was gonna have
and my heart was breaking when I was WhatsApping her saying, Molly, this doesn't work for me. And she says, well, why not? So I said, oh, the cheeks are too chubby and the hair is too much. And she says, yeah, but babies don't have high cheekbones.
I looked online. Babies do not have high cheekbones.
Right?
Yeah.
But then I said to her, oh my God, no, I think this is more complex. We need a bigger talk about this. Then we got into this conversation about the representation of the child in art. And then we said, fine, so when we are going to talk about the birth, we cannot show Noor, right? But we want to show her suggestively. So let's show her with the wet nurse, right? Which is just a holding. So I think these are all things, I'm learning definitely about art from your gorgeous,
Well, the interesting thing about it is that this isn't a mere adaptation, but instead of deepening and retelling in fundamentally new ways. So on that very point, one of the things that I'm very interested in, I'm mindful that my friend, the great Sri Lankan novelist Shamsal Vidura is here. In 4th century Sri Lanka, Roman coins were found. Coins from the Roman Empire were found in 4th century Sri Lanka. There's a whole story there about movement, power,
Mm.
et cetera, et cetera. So coins are in my mind, in my head these days. And what does it mean in a post FTX Bitcoin moment, honestly,
Mm.
to explain the significance
Mm.
of the coin, that the coin
Yeah.
of the realm was the co-emperor's, the empress's coin.
Yeah.
How do you convey that to a young audience that's mostly digital in terms of its, or digital and tap?
Yeah.
Coins don't mean what they used to, right? There's
Yeah.
not even nostalgia even. So is the coin going to figure in the story? And if so, how?
Yeah. So, I think that's a lovely question. And I think it's a question not just for this book, but I think it's a bigger question about, especially when you're dealing with centuries past and the artifacts of the centuries past, as I look at it, right? So when you look at it on screen, it's all the same, big coin, small coin,
It's
big,
flat.
it's all flat. It's the same size. So one of the things I do in my undergraduate classes particularly is I will say to them, no, we are not looking at, coins or images online. We want to actually hold these things as
Yes.
far as possible because of the tactility
Yes.
of the.
Yes.
And I think it is the same thing we want to convey to our young reader, to our young readers, right? So coins, for instance, the way I think it associates with you say to a young person, oh, Noor is really very powerful, right? What does it mean? Yes, so the tiger hunting stuff is really very palpable. I said this to my young niece, actually, who was 9 at that time. I was telling her this story. She said, my God, you must have someone draw this and have someone draw tigers. I don't see tigers anymore, right? So there's a palpable sense. But coins, people are going to hold these coins in those days. People in the harem are going to hold these coins. So these are, I think, these kind of around artifacts, something of the action has to be conveyed to young readers.
So is that what you're imagining visually then, in terms of conveying the significance of what it means that there were minting coins in her authority?
We haven't gotten to be fair, we haven't gotten to the chapter where I've started thinking about how I'm going to convey the coins. But I mean, I think what I try to do with my work is I try to just make things have weight. I try to make you feel what it would be like to touch them. I have utmost respect for illustrators that want to do like clean vector art or whatever, but it's just not my thing, and I think that that's one of the reasons that my work lends itself well to this, because it's like when I draw something, you can feel it.
And so the idea is that eventually we'll get that sense of the coin.
Yes.
I want to stay in the conceptual for a moment. One of the major themes, especially in the back half of the book, Ruby, is the concept of fitna, and the way that figured in Noor's standing, the way she was perceived, the way she was represented and dealt with. It strikes me as a very important feature of her standing in the world of 17th century Mughal India. How do you convey a concept like fitna? Do you decide to for young readers? And if so, how do you do it?
It's a lovely question. It's the how do you say it? It's the soul of this book, because fitna, just to sum up for you, it's an Islamic concept which means essentially chaos, and it's almost always attributed to the woman, to her sexuality, to her power, and many things are fitna, right? So for some people, her being the empress would be fitna, would be chaotic, but nobody goes that far. Historically, the moment when fitna comes to be attributed to her in the records is just the year before the emperor dies. He is captured by one of his noblemen and is taken into custody for 100 days. And she fights this man, that is literally, she gets on a howdah upon an elephant and gets into war. Now, war is the territory that is not acceptable to most men of that time. A co-sovereign is, but a co-sovereign that does everything except war. And so I think that scene of hers getting on the elephant, going to war, losing it, but rising it again, strategizing it, and winning it essentially. So that's.
And don't you even claim in the book that even the win, the rescue, almost confirms the perception of fitna, or the assignation of this, in a sense, right? That the very success of it is what is evidence of her power, her chaos. in a
Exactly.
sense,
Exactly.
which is a kind of a fantastic paradox, right?
Yeah,
The act of rescue actually kind of dooms
Yeah.
her standing at the same time,
exactly.
right?
Exactly.
So for you, Molly, when you're hearing that, or when you're reading it, when you're imagining it, how do you want to convey that dynamism on the page with your drawing?
It's always hard for me to answer questions like that because I have such a methodical way of going through and being like, now we're on this chapter and now,
Right.
you know, and I feel like in order to figure out how I would convey the fit now, I would have to spend a lot of time with my sketchbook, you know,
Well, you need
beforehand.
to start what's happening in front of us right now.
Yeah.
And we can just sort of watch that.
I mean, I think that I would probably convey, you know, multiple moments of it, right? I might convey her being on the howdah. I might convey her also sort of getting ready to go for a battle, which is this moment, right, of going from like the sort of socially approved realm of co-sovereign, but woman's realm to going into the male realm of war. And the way that this process would go is me and Ruby would look at a lot of art that was done at the time. We would speak a lot about the emotions and the moments and what we wanted to convey. And yeah, it would be with my sketchbook, just.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's where you would go. Go ahead.
And actually, I think we've also spoken about in the book, some of your art is going to run through.
Yes.
So I think, you know, the tiger might come back, even though the tiger is not relevant.
Yes,
The gun is going to come back.
exactly.
And then the eye.
Yes.
Do you want to just show them the comment? Because this is, I mean, we just showed you one image of the eye, and I'm mentioning this because I almost see eye coming back in that moment. And
So yeah, let's talk a
do
little
you
bit.
just want to talk to them about the eye and this kind of
Early
image
part
that
of her story.
carries? Yeah, it's an early part, but I think it's the point about the carrying of the pictorial
Mhm.
icons in some senses.
Yes. So
So while Molly is picking this up, when she's born in 1577, the great comet of 1577 was in the skies, right? Can I just read
Please.
one paragraph to animate what we are talking about, so that Molly can talk just a little bit more. So I just want to read a couple of paragraphs here about this just before her birth. When a large comet passed startlingly close to Earth in the autumn and winter of 1577, astronomers, astrologers, philosophers, and monarchs all over Europe and Asia, including the Mughal Emperor Akbar, were spellbound. The distinguished Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe made precise measurements of its paths, findings later used by his student Johannes Kepler to formulate the laws of planetary motion. Known for his curiosity and open mind, 35-year-old Emperor Akbar was in the 21st year of his reign when a comet Zu-Zanab, literally possessed of a tail, became visible in the skies over India, bright enough to be seen in daylight. The celestial body that Europeans call the Great Comet provoked intense discussion in Fatehpur Sikri, then the Mughal capital. Akbar invited astrologers to give their opinion on the form, appearance, and effects of Zu-Zanab's flight. Ancient Indian astrology books describe more than 100 kinds of comets, some possessing tails, other forelocks, that could herald both good and bad fortune in the countries they crossed. Akbar's royal astrologer Jyotik Rai informed him that Zu-Zanab had traveled over Tibet, Western China, Turkestan, Fargana, and Khorasan province in northern Persia, modern-day Iran, where it was observable for 85 days. The comet would produce serious disturbances in those lands, Jyotik Rai said. Persia especially would suffer. The astrologers' predictions were confirmed early in the year when trusted visitors reported to Akbar that the Persian monarch Shah Tahmasp had died and his kingdom was suffering economic woes and bloody political upheaval. What Akbar did not know was that the season of the comet had brought another momentous event, one that would someday affect the fate of his empire. On the road outside Kandahar in what is now Afghanistan, a girl had been born to a couple leaving repressive Persia for Akbar's empire, a land they hoped would be more welcoming to their liberal views on politics and religion. They were part of a caravan making the long and arduous journey to India along a stretch of the Silk Road, the ancient web of trade routes linking East and West. The baby arrived before the turn of the year, a Sagittarius or Capricorn, entering a world where people believe that comets, eclipses, and arrangements of the zodiac shaped an individual's disposition and attitudes. They call their daughter Mihirun Nisa, son of women. So this is the context for our conversation on the comet.
So when I was thinking about how I should portray this comet, which is so important in the book, I thought that I would look at how people of that time period portrayed comets, how they thought about them, because they didn't just think of them right as an astrological or an astronomical phenomenon. They were almost like creatures, you know, just they have tails and forelocks, like some sort of great beast made of firewood. And so I looked at drawings that were done in the middle, that were done in the 1600s in Europe, because I couldn't find Mughal drawings of comets. And one of the ones that struck me is the one that's in the upper right-hand corner, where the comet has a face like a sun. And me and Ruby, our symbol, I want to say, of our correspondence were these eyes that I would draw, these women's eyes. And Ruby would talk a lot about like what eyes mean in terms of gaze, in terms of who's looking at who. But I thought, well, if they could put a face in the comet, I could put the eye in the comet.
Mm.
And so these are the sort of preliminary sketches I do when I'm thinking out something. And there's the final.
Mm.
And so this comet is the herald of Nur, and there's Nur's eye, or the reader's eye, or the chorus's eye, but there's the eye looking back at you from it. And then below, I thought I wanted to do Fatapur Sikri, so that you could put the comet, you know, in the context of the world that it was going over. And because Ruby writes so much about the astronomers of Akbar's court, I was like, how would an astronomer be looking at a comet then? And I looked, they have telescopes. No, they didn't. In 1577, they hadn't been invented yet. So how would they look? And so I found that in the Mughal Empire, they had these sort of stairways to nowhere, is the only way to describe it, that on observatories, so that people could get to an elevated location to observe the sky. And so I drew that there, the stairway towering over the city, and the little figures on it between these little men and the woman's eye.
Mm.
Striking. So I think what that raises for me, well, two things. One, and I imagine we've all sensed this, even from your reading just now, Ruby, even if we haven't, even if not everyone has read the book, how evocative your prose is. That you have very visual writing, especially I've noted at the beginning of chapters, the way that you set scenes is very inviting of the kind of, it situates us visually in the world, which is where I saw, you know, a certain kind of natural dynamism with Molly's work. Where I wanted to go though was something like this, just to reflect a little bit. Maybe you could both reflect on this if we step back for a moment, and then maybe in a couple of minutes we could see if there's questions and comments from our audience. So Salman Rushdie, someone I suspect we all know well enough, has observed that he laments in one of his essays, in Imaginary Homelands, people always talk about what's lost in translation, and Rushdie encourages us to think about what's gained in translation. And I'm wondering if you could each perhaps reflect on what's gained in this collaboration when it comes to the story of Nur.
Oh, another lovely question. Do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's that, it's such a cliche, I'm loath even to say a picture is worth 1,000 words. We've all heard that. It's very embarrassing to say, but it's actually quite true. You can expend an entire book of description trying to get the information that you would have in one visual. I feel like we're taking these young readers into a world that they have not lived in, that no one they've ever met has lived in this world. And by seeing it, they can feel it more. They can feel what it's like to live in it more, in a way that like even the richest, most beautiful, most detailed prose, just by its nature as prose, can't.
So it's gained that way. That's great. Thank you. What about you, Ruby?
I just think I'm growing exponentially in my I don't like the word collaboration, in my co-creation with Molly.
Or conspiracy. That was my suggestion.
Okay.
Can we just say you're co-sovereigns for this project?
Co-sovereigns.
Okay,
Yes,
good.
we like that. You know, I think I said this earlier on, what the prose should be is also under challenge when you're thinking visually all the time. And I'm very intensely thinking visually, not only the art with Molly, but also, the life, the times, the scenes, right? The density of that into the writing. And I also have to do this. So again, we were talking about this earlier on. One of the, maybe I can just show you this. I have a,
Let me put the screen sharing back.
my chapter. So one of the things, the way I was writing the chapters was that I was doing intense storytelling, but things like, and I do want to speak about this, what's the difference between history and legend to the story, right? What is this document?
So now it's screen sharing.
And where is the
manuscript?
Yeah.
That's there.
And so when I started, writing this, these are some of the originals that were going to Molly. So there are things like, for instance, the sidebar here that says Beg and Begum, which is the honorific of the names of the parents, Ghayaz Beg and Asmat Begum, right? So this was supposed to be a textual sidebar. And I've started rethinking about things like this. So for instance, we could just have portraits of Asmat and Ghayaz Beg without describing Beg and Begum, but just saying Asmat Beg and Asmat Begum and Ghayaz
Inviting
Beg.
the reader to
Inviting the reader to understand. So things like this are changing, or so this is because we were talking so much about sidebars and calligraphy. This is one of the originals I'd sent Molly. So things like this are getting very deeply affected. Chronology is getting, because you don't have to. I've never believed in loading people with too many dates, not only in this book but also in my teaching. But you frame the dates through an episode, through an event. But now you have a pictorial hand to do that. So things like that. And I think it's
that's what's being gained through this.
Through this.
And as you say, moving away from the glossary sidebar approach, moves away from kind of a textbook, and instead it's much more exhilarating to learn by making that connection and trying to decode what this picture means, what Begum means, right? So I think that's.
Can I also just say one more thing?
Please.
One of our early chapters is actually, the first chapter that I wrote is about Molly growing up as a girl and getting fascinated by art, and I growing up as a girl and getting fascinated by storytelling. Now, our editor thinks that, gosh, this is being recorded, never mind. He thinks that this is probably not a good idea for the book, but maybe for a piece. But I really think it is and I'm going to try and persuade, because I think it's a fantastic way in which for young readers to connect with your story. I have tested this too many times now, right? The moment you speak about yourself as a girl, right, it just works, period. I mean, you have 4 daughters, right?
Yes, that's right.
It'd be interesting to see what works, right? I mean, you wrote that gorgeous piece on Enid Blyton, right? I mean, they have their own thinking about this.
If you can create the conditions with these. So my last question, as we may prepare for questions from the audience, is that in addition to being, critically acclaimed, aesthetically accomplished, the politics of how you approach the question of history and historiography, Ruby, how does that figure for young readers? Because I can't imagine you're going to leave it out, but how does that figure in the way that you want to tell this story?
And so again, when I was talking about my conversations with girls in the schools, they are asking the questions that I'm asking. Why did we not know about Nur? Right? How do you do this? How do you tell? Why do you love Mughal history? I'm asked all the time. And why do you like Nur Jahan? Right? Or, I mean, when this book came out, I didn't know about this. I was told this, that in India, girls have formed a Twitter group called Empress Twitter group. So I think people are looking for these models. And, as we know, we have this awful right-wing Hindutva regime in India that's wiped out this history as we speak. So I think we are going at it. I have at one point said, speaking about Nur Jahan in one of the national dailies in India, I said, Nur Jahan is the history of India. And the reporter said to me, what do you mean by that? I said, that means that she embodies the plural history of our society, where you could be many things, that you could belong in many ways, that you shared many traditions, many histories. That is being, that heterogeneity, that richness is being condensed to be one kind of people in the nation of India. So I think this work is so important, and where better.
Yes. And I guess maybe the other point that you just raised, I think, is that it's simplistic to presume that you've got to bring politics to this when those girls are bringing it already, in a sense, right? What about you, Molly?
What Ruby said about the cosmopolitanism and the pluralism and the fluidity of identity embodied by Nur Jahan is one of the things that most attracted me to this. And not just in India, obviously, but in all sorts of countries, including my own. There's this notion being pushed of this, one people, one state, this simplistic, narrow, stupid, and profoundly belittling notion of purity is being pushed all over the world. And the story of someone like Nur Jahan, who is a migrant from Persia, who is born literally on the road underneath a comet, who becomes the co-sovereign of Mughal India, a period that's deeply contested now in India, as Ruby said. To me, she embodies such a challenge to the narrowness and stupidity and barrenness of the purity politics of our moment.
Oh, yeah, beautifully put. And in a sense, it's you're going to visualize and put together.
That's a beautiful question.
Why don't we pause there and we will see. I'm not sure how things will work Zoom-wise, but just to begin here in the Jackman building, does anyone have any questions for Ruby or Molly? Yes, go ahead.
I'm not sure.
I think it's the other way.
I'm not sure how to formulate this, so it might be a bit sloppy, but and your point about what's gained in translation, I'm going to go back to what's lost in translation. And I'm more familiar with the storytelling side of things, not being an artist, but am I right to think that the process that you're going through, the craft, is an iterative one, that you're not quite sure where this is leading you, and that's part of the process? So if that's true, the other thing I'm thinking about is this tension between self-rule and rule and sharing sort of sovereignties, right? Self-determination against shared sovereignty. And in particular, Ruby, is if you could, if you were to just rewrite this story for young people without the vision, how has this process shifted your understanding of of your scholarship and the original work that you did?
Yes.
Yeah, great question.
I think it's a beautiful question, and there's so much of this political work that Randy was asking about that I've been doing for quite some time, that is speaking and, thinking what is being erased, what are the ways in which this is being erased, how we need to claim it, and so on. And one of the things I thought to myself very recently, this is a big question for people in America. This is a big question in India. This is a big question here, as I've understood from you and many other people. Because we don't have the language for it right now, what we call the question of democracy, right? Which is the question of belonging and citizenship. What are the icons for it, right? What are the stories for it? What is the history for it? How do people imagine that we know the history? Right? There is a common sense, there's an assumption around it. So I think I'm thinking anew that the charge is so important to, you said this in one of your lectures to us upstairs, that, the work that you do, Dale, is to deepen, to make better the past. Because most of the time people say the work we want to do is to better the future. But actually, I think if you don't deepen and enrichen the past, you cannot do that work of belonging and citizenship. So I think, to me, more than ever before, this is a book about the political struggle that I see about belonging at this time, from where I stand from this landscape, right?
And, you know, and in a sense, if you think about the concept of an icon is meant to be a thing to look through to something else, right? In kind of its religious sense.
Yes.
So in a sense, I think what you're describing is that Nur in this project is kind of an icon to see through to a more pluralist, cosmopolitan, fluid sense of human life, as opposed to the more rigid and purist one that we're struggling with. Other questions? Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks for this wonderful conversation. I loved hearing about the collaboration. And I've got a question about the visuals to complement, where, I mean, I'm so struck with the images. They're gorgeous. I love them. But I'm also curious about the ways in which they both do and don't look like Mughal miniature paintings. You know, they've got much more motion in them. They don't have that kind of static, lapidary quality. The color palette's really different. So I was curious as to like what decisions went into making these images rather than something that looks closer to Mughal paintings.
So this is a really good question, and it's something I've thought a lot about. So, I mean, first of all, the reason they don't look like Mughal paintings is because they can't look like Mughal paintings, because to study how to do Mughal miniatures is such a rigorous craft. I was lucky enough to visit the miniature school in Lahore. I have several friends who have studied in that miniature tradition. You can't just jump into that. I couldn't just go in and be like, I'm gonna, get my squirrel hair brush and start grinding, like start grinding my lapis into paint and, just like hit it. So it's that was something that from the start we spoke about, that I'm not ever going to be capable of doing Mughal miniatures. And so how do I take a spirit from Mughal work, but make it my own and have it be, how do I put, I don't want to say respectful because that's not the word, but admiring, like fucking in awe of Mughal work as I've always been, without basically doing like a bad, inadequate copy of it, right? And so what I did was I spent a lot of time studying stuff that I'm like, I can do that, right? Like I can do a border like that. It might not be as perfect. I'm much, sloppier and paint splatterier than, I'll never have the meditative focus of, Mughal miniaturist, but I can learn from that, and I can learn how to do that. And then also I can look at other things, like I can look at Mughal architecture and figure how I would draw that in my style, or I could look at like, for instance, this comet thing, right? Like there's a mixture of the flat, like how the star is with the eye and the three-dimensional, and that's I guess, but everything is a negotiation. Like you're talking about this as an iterative process. That's so true. I mean, like every single one, I feel like I'm figuring out, what am I doing? How am I gonna do it? And I always start just by looking really deeply.
I had a question. You raised in the introduction the question of the public humanities, and I was curious.
I don't need the mic. Great question. And again, I think there are assumptions around it, right? Assumptions, actually, there are two words here, public and the humanities. And both, as we speak, are being contested, are being renegotiated, there's this big debate in the world about the place of the humanities has always been there, right? And so with this big debate, there's also the public, right? So, so I think you choose your form. I think that's the best way, I think, I would like to respond to it. People have very technical ideas about it, which is, so for instance, in my case, when you, as an academic historian, when you're making this transition to writing nonfiction, people assume two things. One is they think the switch is really automatic, and I've been told many times, okay, drop the footnotes, right? And no, I didn't drop the footnotes. Not only did I not drop the footnotes, I actually wanted to build in the integrity of my scholarship into a form of storytelling. But for me, the loveliest experience in public relationships, by which I mean outside the academy now, has been that, I'm not the holder of knowledge who goes there and tells the people this great history that I know, as we were talking earlier on. It's these girls, it's the audiences who led me to do the work I'm doing with Molly. Because I was very clear that this is not a form I can do. So somehow they capacitated me. So I think it's a very dynamic, very playful process. You just have to realize that you are just bloody lucky that, you have these years and you put this together, and now you're sitting in the middle of these amazing minds, right? And if you're ready for play, then I think it's fantastic. And I think that's the best public scholarship. So I don't know whether this is technically answering your question, but I tend to respond experientially to these things.
And then I'm curious, Molly, now you have a public profile with the work you do. So how do you understand a project like this, which in a sense is coming more from the academy, right, than maybe some of your earlier collaborations, which are in political contexts or journalism? So do you have a sense? I'm just curious of response to the same question.
I mean, I don't think of this as coming from the academy. I think of this coming from Ruby.
Well played. That's very nicely said. Yes.
But in terms of the public, I mean, I'm not from the academy. I dropped out of my very horrifically bad art school that I went to because it was cheap. I don't have any degree. That's not the word from. However, I think the art world has a similar idea that the academy does about like, oh, the art world is over here, and then there's the community and the public that's over here, and maybe we as artists can condescend to bring down our light onto the community or the public or whatever, and be so gracious as to enlighten them. It's a very, very stupid idea. And I have always been revolted by that. I've always thought the idea that there's only like a small group of people that are capable of appreciating words or history or art is so stupid and so misguided. I mean, all sorts of people like my work. I mean, cashiers like my work, sex workers like my work, people who are like maybe homeless for the moment have told me they like my work, and also people who are really rich like my work, people without, people who have no degree, who never went to school like my work. And I think that I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing specialist stuff, obviously, but for me, I want to create work that is not just shoved into the art world for special art world people. I want it to be something that anyone can access and that anyone feels welcome to. And I think that if I haven't done nothing else right, I've definitely done that right. I think I have a more diverse group of people who like my work than most people do.
There's another question over here. Yes.
I want to zero in on one image that I found especially magnificent, which is the tiger hunt.
Thank you.
And so, for full disclosure, I'm a colonial historian. So, I think one of the pitfalls you managed to avoid splendidly is the pitfall of the tropes of the Raj, the colonial hunt, and which of course is an exercise in masculinity and conquest and all of this, and you really turned it on its head. So I wondered if you consciously avoided that, or if you excavated beyond it, or I mean, how did you get to the pre-colonial Mughal hunt, in a sense, is what I'm getting at, as an exercise of sovereignty and queenship.
So that's a really astute comment. So I actually looked at a lot of British drawings from the Raj too, in large part because I wanted to know how a howdah straps onto an elephant. And I needed someone who was like drawing the elephants from more perspective, so I could kind of get the mechanics of that. And you're right. There's like this really weird thing that the British stuff do. It's all like He-Man and safari hat, and then like, yeah, exactly. And I looked at a lot of Mughal things of hunts also, and to see how those were positioned. And I mean, I've always found like Mughal drawings of battles and hunts and violence. In some ways, they're like, I don't know, they remind me of like whirlpools or something. There's like bodies everywhere, like things are all like in motion, they're all falling. Like it's such a different aesthetic, right? Than the way that like the British colonialists portray that sort of violence. And for me, I guess I wasn't necessarily thinking of subverting how the Raj was doing it. I was like, look at this energetic young woman who has like so much power. It's about her, right? Like she is, it's her and the tiger, but ultimately it's her. And I think the moment isn't her like standing there with the dead tiger, right? It's like them meeting their eyes, almost like, here's this like king of the beasts, right? And here's the queen of the land, and in the Raj tiger, that respect, I noticed. And yeah, I guess that's how to do it. I mean, it's funny. I don't necessarily, when I'm like doing these things, like have like a super like thought out statement about what I'm trying to say. But I think that if you start with certain preconceptions, like my idea is that I want this to be about Nur, then different things follow from that.
The question right there. Or no, go ahead, please. Or
I think she was first.
yeah, Shiver.
I had a question about feminist history writing. So I imagine, the masculinist history writing tradition has a continuity, right? So if as a masculinist today, you're trying to imagine a masculine figure in the past, there's like a history, there's like a archive that continues that you can kind of hark back onto to resurrect a perhaps unknown figure. But as a feminist today, how do you resurrect a so-called feminist figure 4 centuries ago? Like, what are the assumptions or projections or lack of that do you make as a feminist today about like what she would be doing then, which comes as that?
Yes,
right?
yes.
Great question.
I think that's really to work through this very complicated past in which, because of the masculinist project, we have lost her to history up until now. Now she's no longer lost. Of the kind of agitated quality of just simply making by saying this is a feminist figure, right? Now, having said that, the question for me nonetheless, because I'm talking about the courtly society, I'm talking about a whole range of other issues in which the major complex of the politics into which she's going to shine are male figures, right? How do I then think about power in that context? Right. And so this is where all this work of the symbol, the imperial orders, the declaration of the name in the Friday prayers as monarch, these are all the male figures of the time, all the male writers of the time, all the courtiers of the time, and historians today will get that, right? And that's what I call bullet point history. But what are the ways in which a powerful figure lives, right? Why is this kind of question of hunting all pervasive onto the pages of her husband's memoir? Why is he talking nonstop about this? This is something I had to figure out, right? I had to work with historians who've written extensively on arms and armaments, on the symbols of monarchy in early modern times, so as to also, the Raj was also, Eric, quite complicit in reducing her power into this sexualized, orientalized, harem manipulative, gorgeous queen. So I want to keep her gorgeousness. I want to keep her allure. I want to keep her love, all of those kinds of things. But love in all its richness and complexity, her power in all its richness and complexity, without also, so one of the struggles for me was, how, because I began to feel this, how to talk about her ambition. See, people don't want to take that on board. I wanted to keep that on board. I mean, she fought tooth and hill till the end, right, to keep her power. She loses it precisely because of the masculinist world that you're talking about. But I have not claimed her feminist even once. I think that would be, it's not just anachronistic. It's not the descriptor, right? So I think that issue of language
it collapses things you were kind of saying earlier, right?
Yeah, it also minimizes things, and then there are assumptions, right? So I think it's also because I'm not because I'm not writing in my mother tongue, which is Hindi Urdu, right? There is a translation of it in Hindi Urdu, which my mother loved. She was hooked onto it. And she said to me, "Bahut achhi kitab likhi hai. You've really written a good book," she said to me, right? Because she told me this. So I think there are issues of languages of that level, but also languages of the languages within English, right? And the conceptual history within English that, and this is the I think challenge of a work of this kind.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Right, yeah, go ahead.
So
Hey, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. A comment first and then a question. So my daughter, who you've met, Ruby, is 9 and asking the sort of questions you probably asked your mum there. So we need a book for that age group as well, please. Everyone needs to know about Nur, you know. So I think, but the visuals are beautiful, and you know, I really look forward to seeing the combination of the two. And was this a decision you made because now you had all these requests for a book for young adults to bring in sort of illustrations, and a follow-on to that is why do all of you think, you know, in adult novels we don't have visuals really? And it's sad in a way, because people often say to children, "No, there's too many pictures there, you know, you need more," and a lot is lost without visuals, and a lot of is gained through this sort of work.
I think there's a few reasons. First of all, publishers are cheap and it costs a lot of money to print color books, especially. I learned from my first book. But yeah, genres in commercial publishing have gotten more and more narrow, right? And like more and more sort of shrunken. And I also think, illustration had been pigeonholed either as, you know, children's stuff or graphic novels, right? Which is also like an incredibly rich vein that has lots of stuff for, you know, adults, but it's different than this. And I think it's a shame because in the 19th century, I mean, they did so many beautiful illustrated books like Dickens, you know, Pushkin, you know, Dostoevsky. When I was, when I saw this translation of Omar Khayyam's The Rubaiyat with the Edmund Dulac, and illustration like in my world and shattered me. And they were like, "I want to be an illustrator," you know, from this. I was very bad. I cut them all out of the library book that with a razor blade that I snuck in and took them home because I wanted them so much. Sorry. I hope I've done my penance for that one.
I'm assuming it wasn't the Toronto Public Library, so we'd have to do a Canadian.
No. It was it was a suburb of New York. But you know, I mean, Khayyam's The Rubaiyat is an immortal work of poetry, but also those illustrations, you know, fucking broke my heart open. And I think it's a shame. I think that there should be more illustration in stuff for adults.
You know, to Randy's first question, I said that now was happening for a really very long time, but I really, honestly, I think I decided to do this because of Molly, because we were writing, and I thought, you know, Bart has gone, but he asked, you know, the question about Mughal art and its kind of dynamism versus the newness and so on. I mean, I thought this was a very playful painter. This is somebody I wanted. Thought, fine, then I'm going to do a new form and let her do a new form. It literally, this was has to. I mean, I'm slow in this, I feel. Right. So my right.
It's also the other person. I mean, you even described your
our friendship. Yes.
Exactly. There you go.
Oh, I need to show you all something. This was when we got the book deal together. we weren't in the same city because of COVID. So I sent Ruby some champagne. Let me there. And let me screen share. I think I failed to screen share again. I'm very bad at this.
Everyone else. Right. One last question, one final question right over there. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. This was just gorgeous and scintillating, and thank you for sharing this work. I have a question that started to be answered, but one of the things that I was thinking about with in relation to the question about feminist history and historiography, the way in which as an early modernist who worked mostly on England at the Atlantic world, one of the things we've seen over the past past 5 to 10 years, I think, is a sort of reparative recovery of exceptional queens, aristocratic women, almost entirely white women, and what some people call the sort of girl bossification of history, mostly for younger readers. And one of the things that I was sort of thinking about as you were talking about your project is also how this works cuts against what can often be not just this particularly masculine view of history, but also sometimes a white feminist recovery of history. So I was wondering if that was something you've been thinking about at all. But I also have sort of very basic question, which is in terms of the different kinds of public audiences, which was also something I was thinking about. I was struck by how many audiences ask you to, could you please sort of write for younger readers, and then what you saw from those readers, the questions they were asking. And I was sort of wondering if you saw some assonances or perhaps disparities between sort of the reasons why people had asked you to speak to younger audiences, and then what you the reception or the critical avenues into the work that you saw from the audiences themselves.
Yeah, I think that so the first question about all these tensions about reclaiming, right? I don't like the phrase, so I'm using it as a critique. You know, giving voice to the figure. I'm very aware of that, right? And yet, in a context in which there is such deep dismissal, erasure, non-recognition, this is also the reason why I've been thinking, and I've been for a long time thinking categorizations, right? And actually denying categorizations. So anything that's called feminist history also builds an assumption, right? It becomes supplemental. People think feminist history equals women's history, or that it's just about women. Well, the first thing is, if you're really going to make those assumptions, you should really do your 101 in WGS, because I think feminist history is not equal to women's history. It's much more complicated. It's about a process. It's about how you do it, what you unearth, what you write about. It's all of these things. But there's also this kind of politics, right? That we were talking about, earlier on, the political politics, aside from the academic politics of the losses that are incurred. So I'm quite vigilant about these things, which is why also I think the question about, making these very clear assertions about exactly what happened, because you want to really think about the so-called truth or the status of the truth, right? And one of the things that helped me a lot, and this is before Molly came into my life, which is that, I was thinking through the pictorial evidence in a huge, huge way, where I didn't have the information. I would do intense amount of scene setting based upon this archival work. And I started to find out that this was not contextual. The context was driving my story. It was becoming the narrative, right? So this was not, but that also takes us back, because we are talking about the 16th century. There are very serious issues about relationship with rivers, about leaves, about trees, about certain kinds of abodes, about certain means of travel. So it sort of makes you rethink your evidentiary ground, right? So, I don't know that that's a sufficient sort of response, because it's a very big question, very important question. The other thing about when these questions kept coming up repeatedly, one thing was that I want to be clear, it was not just South Asians who were asking me these questions, okay? I mean, this was I was speaking in America, I've spoken here in Canada with my publicist here, in the Middle East, in India. So there were a variety of forums where this kept on coming up. And I was very attached to the idea, very moved, very emotional that people would ask me that, because there was one instance in which one woman stood up, and she was of Indian origin. And she said, I have granddaughters and I don't have a story like this to tell her. I think you should do it. That's literally what she said to me. But I was shy because I thought it's an act of great responsibility, right? And to be honest, I wasn't sure. I've been talking about the form, but there was also this parallel issue that was going on. So that's how I come to, that's why the elongated now, right? But then I think you had to happen. And I think sometimes it's only then that things can, I don't know. I mean, this sounds like made in heaven. I think it is, right?
We've come to the end of our time. Let me begin, this kind of closing simply by asking you to join me in thanking the staff of the Jackman Humanities Institute for putting together this event, both here and all the advertising that went into it, and likewise online. And then on behalf of my colleague, Professor Alison Keith, the director of the Jackman Humanities Institute, please join me in thanking our co-sovereigns for today's session, Ruby Lau and Molly Crabapple.
Thank you so much.
And I do want to add one thank you to Natasha from Jewish Studies, who's been really amazing, and to our guests.
Have a good night, everybody. See you later.